Hey everybody, Dr. O here, and welcome to USLO 2.3. Now, in the first two USLOs, we learned a lot of general concepts and language around chemical reactions and the reactants that can go into them and the products that can be created. And in this USLO, we're going to be putting together several of those concepts and continuing to build on our language around the chemistry of reactions. So one of the things we're going to do is define what energy is, look at the different types of energy, kinetic and potential, and learn about this molecule right here, adenosine triphosphate, also known as ATP. I'm going to show you the structure of ATP and tell you how the body utilizes ATP for energy. And then we're going to learn that certain chemical reactions will be endergonic and some of them will be exergonic. Now, what we're learning here is about the flow of, I guess we could say the flow of some sort of an energy into or out of a chemical reaction based upon what's happening. And so we'll get into that discussion in this unit. We're going to learn about how chemical reactions will proceed at different rates and look at the factors that can influence those chemical reaction rates, such as catalyst, or in the case of the body, enzymes. We're going to learn what those are and give those some definitions. And then we'll learn about temperature, pH, concentration, different concentrations of reactants, different concentration of our enzymes, and how these can influence the rate of reactions, how quickly or slowly reactions move forward. And then we're going to learn about the different types of reactions. So we've already had exposure to who the reactants are and who the products are in reactions. But what we haven't necessarily seen yet are these two terms right here. So we've got synthesis or anabolic type reactions, which we can further classify as a dehydration synthesis. And we're going to learn that these are endergonic. Now, if we look at decomposition, we can also call these catabolic reactions. We would call them hydrolysis or hydrolysis, and that they're exergonic. And I'm going to draw your attention to these two areas right here. And the reason why is that there's a lot of language packed in to each one of these. So you might be asked, is a catabolic reaction an exergonic reaction or is it endergonic? So you need to be able to associate catabolic and exergonic. You might be asked, is hydrolysis a decomposition reaction or a synthesis reaction? And you would have to know that hydrolysis is associated with decomposition. So even just these titles here on this particular slide are going to give you a clue to the sorts of information you need to have associated together as we move through this particular USLO. So with that, let's get started. So let's switch gears and talk about energy. So in the physical sciences, we define energy as the capacity to do work. And generally what we're talking about is the act of applying a force to something to make some sort of an action occur. Now, energy is kind of elusive because it doesn't have mass, it doesn't take up space, but we do have ways to measure it. Typically, we measure it in terms of the work that was done. And if we try to put this in a mathematical formula, it might elude us a little bit, but we all have an understanding of what energy is. We know that the bigger the task, the harder the task, the more energy it took to perform that. So inherently, we have some understanding of what energy is and what it does. And thankfully, in this unit, we don't have to put any mathematics behind that. We just need to have an understanding and be able to define it and give it language. Now, in the physical sciences, there are two general categories of energy. We have kinetic energy and we have potential energy. Now, if we look at the word kinetic, this prefix K-I-N-E or K-I-N-E-T, that actually means motion. And ik means pertaining to. So pertaining to motion, that's what kinetic energy is. So kinetic energy is the energy of motion. An example of that would be somebody riding a bike. This person is in the act of riding a bike. She's in motion. Whereas potential energy is stored energy, energy that's about to happen, something that could be released. What's an example of that? Oh, how about a few sticks of dynamite? Nothing's happened yet with this, but it sure could. And at which point it would switch from becoming potential to kinetic. So that's another thing about energies. Energy can be transformed from potential to kinetic energy. So for example, stored energy can be released resulting in action. We could light our dynamite on fire and then we would have a whole lot of kinetic energy. Now what we don't say on this slide is that we could take potential energy and turn it into, we could take kinetic energy and turn it into potential energy if we had the girl get off her bike and sit down. Technically we could do that, but we tend to think in terms of going from potential to kinetic. Just tends to be how we think of those things. Now, there are a lot of different forms of energy. We have chemical energy, electrical energy, mechanical energy, radiant or electromagnetic energy. So these are all things that we possibly have experienced in the world. So what is chemical energy? Well, it's stored energy in the bonds of chemical substances, like our dynamite, for example. But in an anatomy and physiology class, we want to think in terms of where we might find chemical energy in the body. And we're going to find that in fat. Fat is basically, one of its functions is to act as fuel storage. So when we break down fat, we're basically finding a way, the body has found a way to harness the energy from that and use fat as a fuel source. Even within the bonds of ATP, we have stored energy. So these are examples of how biological systems manage chemical energy. Now, electrical energy, I think many of us understand because we have a utility bill that involves the electrical energy that we've used to do things like run the television, run our lights, keep the refrigerator going, things like that. But in the body, we also have electrical energy. Tends to work the same way, believe it or not. So what's happening with electrical energy is that you have the movement of charged particles. The same thing is happening whether it's the wiring going to your house that turns your lights on, or whether it's the movement of particles to cause a muscle contraction in your body. So examples of electrical energy in the physical body are nerve impulses. Nerve impulses require the use of charged particles moving around in order to create that nerve impulse. And then consequently, the nerve impulse is going to lead to the next thing, which is mechanical energy. Most of us have an understanding of mechanical energy. This is a force that's directly involved in moving matter. So you can think about your car. Your car is a great example of mechanical energy. So are the bodies that we live in. For example, once that nerve gets fired up, it's going to send a signal to muscle and cause the muscle to contract, at which point we get to be in the car, making the car move. So all about mechanical energy when we're talking about getting motion in some sort of form of matter. And this last one, radiant or electromagnetic energy. What are we talking about here? Well, this is energy that's going to travel in wave form. So for example, heat travels in wave form. We call that infrared waves. Visible light is also a wave form. Ultraviolet light, which comes from the sun, or even X-rays, which you're going to experience in a medical office. These are all forms of electromagnetic energy. Now, the one of these that the body actually generates is heat. So we have the capacity through our biological processes to release heat and generate radiant energy. That happens. But mostly what we can think of is that our bodies also have ways to manage many of these. For example, we utilize visible light in our sense of sight. We also use ultraviolet light from the sun to manufacture vitamin D. So the body, in this case, might not be so much about creating these forms of energy as it is about utilizing them, although we do make infrared waves, which is heat. So as we just saw, energy can be converted from one form to another. It can be converted from chemical to mechanical or even mechanical to radiant. So for example, in our houses, we can turn on a lamp and that act converts electrical energy into light energy and radiant energy. So those are examples of energy conversion. In our bodies, for example, we can take a muscle contraction, which actually got generated by a chemical energy, and turn it into a mechanical energy. And as a result of doing that, because of the chemical processes that are involved, we also generate some energy in the form of heat. Now, all of these systems, whenever we have a conversion from one energy form to another, in all of these systems, there's always a little bit of loss of energy. So energy conversion is inefficient because of this. So there's always going to be a loss. We're going to lose it as heat typically. And even though we're losing heat, we might be able to recover some of that in some other process. But ultimately, the minute you start putting things in motion, you're going to be experiencing a loss. Hallelujah, we got something done by getting into motion. But as a result of that, we're going to be operating eventually in some sort of deficit, which is why we have to keep fueling up. The more you do, the more you got to refuel. Now, in the body, ATP is the big molecule of energy. And the way we get ATP is that cells take in glucose, simple sugars, from carbohydrates, and they use it to make ATP. Now, here's your chemical reaction. I'll tell you what you're looking at here. So this is the chemical formula for glucose. And glucose, in the presence of oxygen inside of a cell, is capable of producing ATP, water, and carbon dioxide. So that's what we end up getting when we take in glucose and oxygen, and the cells take it and do their magic with it. Now, like I said, glucose and oxygen are going to undergo a reaction to produce ATP. So what does ATP actually stand for? Well, it's this molecule, and it's called adenosine triphosphate. So you might not know what adenosine is, but you probably know what tri means. Tri means 3, and phosphate is a group of atoms that are made up of a phosphorus atom and some oxygen atoms. So without getting real heavy into the chemistry of this ATP molecule, I want to show you where the magic is. So if we make an ATP molecule, basically what we've done is we've taken this ribose, which is a sugar, not necessarily this sugar up here, but a form of this sugar right here, and we attach this molecule called adenosine to it. And then we have these 3 phosphates, 1, 2, 3. And the magic of ATP comes in removing this last phosphate right here, because there is energy stored in this bond. So that when we remove that last phosphate, that's going to release energy. And the body is capable of capturing this energy and doing work with it. So that's why the body is all about making ATP. Now, as we've already stated, chemical reactions are inherently inefficient. You don't recover 100% of what you put into a reaction in the products. So whatever you have as total energy in your reactants, you're always going to lose a little bit in the creation of the products. Or the other possibility is that you have to put some energy into the system and make the system work that way. But either way, there's going to be a movement of energy as a result of a chemical reaction. And depending upon where that energy occurs in a chemical reaction, the chemical reaction will be either considered exergonic or endergonic. So what do these terms mean? Well, exergonic means that reactions are going to give off energy. So if we look at the word exergonic, the first 2 letters, ex, like exit, exterior, that basically means it goes outside of. So in this reaction, an exergonic reaction, the heat is actually leaving the whole process. So we could write an example chemical reaction like this, and in this scenario what would be happening is that energy would be leaving, and it would be leaving on the products side of the reaction. So this is an example of an exergonic reaction. Now an endergonic reaction is going to basically use up energy in its chemical process. So if we look at the word ender or endo, that basically means going into. I know we don't spell it with the I, but it means going into. And in this scenario, whatever we end up with on the other side of the transformation arrow in our equation is going to have more energy than the reactants that went into that reaction. So let's bring up that chemical reaction. And where's the energy going to flow here? Well, it's going to flow in on the reactants side. This is an example of an endergonic reaction. So if we just look at what we have here, we could almost think of the energy in an exergonic reaction being part of the products, even though we've lost that energy. It appears on the product side. And in the endergonic reaction, we could think of it as being part of the reactants going into the equation. So let's look at an example. Let's say that we're sitting around a campfire. Now, why do you even have a fire? Well, you have a fire because it puts off heat and it keeps you warm. So the act of the flame radiating heat, would that be endergonic or exergonic? Well, the heat is leaving the flame, so we would call that exergonic. Now, let's say that we're sitting around that same campfire and we wanted to eat something, so we bring out one of our steaks. And we put that steak over the flame. And we know that that flame is going to release heat, but now we're going to be using that heat for the purposes of the steak. And we know that that heat is going to go into the steak, and eventually that steak is going to get cooked. So the act of cooking a steak, is it exergonic or is it endergonic? Well, the act of cooking the steak relies upon endergonic reactions. We're putting energy into that piece of meat in order to get it to cook. So it's almost like you have to have some place where that heat's coming from, and it's coming from right here. So those are your examples. Now, if you've spent any time in the kitchen or a chemistry lab, there's something that you learn about chemical reactions, and that is that they all happen at different rates. Some are exceptionally fast, and some seem to take forever. So I'm a cook. I tend to spend some time in the kitchen. The thing that I know is that it takes a sweet potato well over an hour to cook, but it takes a boiled egg about 7 minutes. So different chemical reactions have different rates of reactions. So chemical reactions occur at particular rates. Now, there's an interesting thing in the body, and that is most biological reactions occur too slowly to sustain life. So it's great that we have all these chemical reactions, but without some assistance, these reactions would occur too slowly and we would actually die. So how has Mother Nature come up with a way to deal with that? Well, she has created something known as a catalyst. So what is a catalyst? Well, a catalyst is a substance that has the ability to enter into a chemical reaction and speed up that rate without actually getting consumed in that reaction. So a catalyst, which we could say maybe is made up of XYZ, steps into a chemical reaction, speeds it up, and at the end of that reaction, it steps back out and it is still XYZ. So it hasn't undergone any change. Now, what is a catalyst actually doing? Well, if we look at our energy time chart that we have here, let's say that we have a chemical reaction that starts here and has to go through this process in order to happen. What this is telling us is that most chemical reactions require some sort of an input of energy to meet a threshold in order to be driven forward. And in this particular reaction, we're starting off with some high energy reactants and we're ending up with low energy products. We could have just the opposite happening here. That doesn't really matter. What matters is the effect of a catalyst. So let's say we run this same reaction, but this time we add a catalyst to the reaction. Well, what will happen here is it's going to lower the energy required to drive that reaction forward, causing the reaction to happen a little more quickly as a result of that. We still end up with the products. We still started off with the reactants, but we got everything more quickly. Now in the body, we have catalysts, but we don't call them that. We actually call them enzymes. So in our bodies, it is the enzymes that are doing the heavy lifting to make chemical reactions happen fast enough to sustain life. Now, as I said, the enzymes are going to be the biological catalysts that we find in our body. Now, what are they made of? Well, they're typically made of protein. They're big protein molecules, and as you're going to learn later on in this unit, proteins are huge molecules. This is also where vitamins and minerals come into play because they work in conjunction with enzymes to make sure that these reactions occur efficiently. And what enzymes are doing specifically is they're lowering the activation energy to help speed this chemical reaction along. So what do we mean by that? Well, remember I said there's this hump that the reaction has to basically get over in order to get the product. Well, the energy to go from the basic input energy of our reactants to this downhill slide, this is known as the activation energy of this chemical reaction. And what a catalyst does is it lowers that energy requirement. So in this reaction, we don't have a catalyst, so we've got a pretty high energy activation requirement here. But in this one, where we have the presence of a catalyst, that energy activation requirement was significantly reduced, and as a result, it makes that reaction happen much more quickly and much more easily, and actually much more efficiently. So we saw this example when we were looking at metabolism, and this is the catabolism part of metabolism, where we take big molecules and we break them down into small molecules. But how do we do that? Well, we do this with enzymes. That's how we do that. So you start off with an enzyme. That's what we have here. And then we have our little substrate, which is the molecule that we're going to be doing some work on. Now, every enzyme has this unusual shape part right here. That's one of the beauties of using proteins, is that the functionality of a protein is based upon its shape. I'll say that again because it's important. The functionality of a protein is based on its shape. And that's what I'm implying with my little image right here. And what will happen is that this particular enzyme is looking for this particular molecule because it's designed to have that molecule fit right here in this active site. Now, once this molecule, this substrate, comes and sits on that active site of the enzyme, now the enzyme is going to be able to do some work on it. Now let's think of this as like two big parts of a molecule. This is one big molecule made up of two smaller parts of molecules right here. And what this enzyme is going to do is it's going to work on this part that's holding them together. So while this big molecule is sitting in the enzyme's getting to do some work on it. Now once the enzyme is done doing the work on this, driving the chemical reaction forward, basically taking our big substance and making it into a small substance, once it's done with that, then what we're going to end up with is our two smaller products, our little molecules, like what we have here. And then after the enzyme releases our two small particles, guess what it's going to do? It's going to go look for another big molecule to break down. So this is what enzymes are doing for us. They're basically going out looking for those. This is one of the things that enzymes are doing for us, is they're taking those big molecules and they're breaking them down into small molecules. That's what enzymes are doing. And what is so special about this region right here, this active site? Well, this is where the molecule has to sit, the molecule that's going to have work done on it, the molecule that's undergoing the chemical reaction. That's where it's going to sit. And to help it sit even better, we're typically going to have some sort of a vitamin sitting in there to help make sure that the fit is 100% correct. So this is a little bit about how catabolism works, taking big molecules and turning them into small molecules, thanks to enzymes. Now, what about the other half of this reaction, where we take these small molecules and we knit them together to make bigger molecules, things that we need, like muscle and bone? Well, we're going to basically start off with our parts, our small parts that maybe we made from catabolism, and we're going to put them in a different enzyme. And this enzyme is going to do something such as knit these two small parts together. So we still call these substrates. This is our enzyme. So once the substrate sits in the active site of the enzyme, we can see that now the enzyme is starting to knit these two smaller particles together, and that eventually we're going to end up with a large molecule, something like bone or muscle. So this is how an enzyme works in anabolism. It can take small particles and turn them into big particles that the body needs. This is the beauty of enzymes, speeding all of these processes along. Now, like any chemical reaction, catalysts are going to require a specific environment in order to function, and things that can influence the functionality of enzymes include temperature. So having body temperature maintained within a particular range is important, not only to preserve the integrity of tissues, because you start to damage tissues if you get too hot or too cold, but it's also to ensure that our chemical reactions are working just right. Because if you get too cold, certain enzymatic functions won't work. If you get too hot, other enzymatic functions won't work. So we need to stay within a range to ensure that all of our enzymatic functions are occurring the way that they're supposed to. So temperature is important. pH, maintaining the right acid-base balance to support an enzyme's function, are also important. So for example, in the mouth comes in with a pH of about 7-ish. And we have an enzyme in the mouth called amylase that starts the breakdown of carbohydrates. So, you eat a piece of candy, and the enzymes in saliva are going to start to break that down. But by the time that piece of candy and the enzymes in the saliva make it down to the stomach, well, now the pH has changed, coming in at around 2. Well, that pH is too severe for amylase to continue to work. So actually amylase no longer works, other enzymes pick back up, and then we shift the stomach contents into the small intestines, where we undergo another pH shift, and then different enzymes work there. But this is an example of where having the proper pH becomes really important. Now, believe it or not, there are conditions where body pH can become too acidic, and when that happens, we start to lose functionality of our enzymes, which means now we're having compromises in our physiology. The body can handle slight alkalinity better than it can handle acidity. So we have a tendency to closely monitor what's happening with acidity in the body, and we have mechanisms that kick into gear when we become a little too acid. We have mechanisms that kick into gear when we become too alkaline, but the body's really watching what's happening with acidity. And part of it has to do with ensuring that our enzymes work just right. And then also the availability of our enzymes, the concentration of enzymes. So let's say that we had a lot of enzymes available, and we had some substrates that were looking. This substrate is going to have no problem undergoing a reaction because there are so many enzymes available to do the work that's needed. But if you didn't have a lot of those enzymes around, well, now the substrate is going to have to go on a scavenger hunt to look for an enzyme, and it may never find it. So concentration of enzymes are also going to be important. And enzymes come from proteins, which means that you have to have adequate protein intake in order to ensure that you have appropriate enzymes in order to drive the rest of your chemical reactions. Now, we've been talking about chemical reactions, and the way that we write a chemical reaction is to write it in terms of a chemical equation. So let's bring up a chemical equation. All right, now let's talk about the different parts of the chemical equation. And I'm going to draw your attention to the first thing right here, this arrow. This is called a transformation arrow. And the transformation arrow is going to divide the things that are undergoing the reaction from the things that have undergone the reaction. So we're just going to draw a line right down the middle. So the things that we find on the left of the transformation arrow, these are going to be called the reactants. These are the substances that are going to go into the reaction. These are the things that are going to be transformed as a result of going into this chemical reaction. Now on the other side of the transformation arrow, the right of the transformation arrow, this is what we end up with as a result of our reactants having undergone a transformation. And this would be our products, or we might just end up with one product, but product or products, this is what we see on the right of the transformation arrow. And whenever we write a chemical equation, we need to think of it being balanced. Now, fortunately, we don't have to do that in this unit. But what I can tell you is that whatever you went into the reaction with, you have to account for it on this side of the transformation arrow. And that's called the law of conservation of mass. Basically, the universe doesn't allow you to create anything new or destroy anything that's already here. It just gets transferred from one form to another. So in this case, we're transferring A and B into C, and we're probably going to lose some energy in the process as well, because I don't know, maybe this is exergonic, or maybe we use up some energy in the process. Maybe this is endergonic. We don't know. But this is basically what we're implying when we write A plus B, transformation arrow, gives us C, a chemical reaction. Now we have three main types of chemical reaction when we're thinking about the physical universe. The first one is called the synthesis reaction. Now, as the name synthesis implies, it's basically combining substances. So this is where you're going to take atoms or maybe small molecules, and you're going to combine them together in order to make bigger molecules, more complex substances. So let's bring up an example equation. So in this equation, we're taking A and B, and we're combining it to make this big conglomeration that we're just generally going to call AB. Typically, these reactions are anabolic. And with anabolic, we mean we take the small molecules and we make big things out of them, like muscle and bone. Another quality of these synthesis reactions, these anabolic reactions, is that they have a tendency to be endergonic. We have to put a little energy into these in order to get what we want. And in the body, the types of reactions that we see typically with a synthesis reaction are going to be what we call a dehydration synthesis. Well, what is that? Well, let's have a look. So without getting real chemically here, I'm just going to say generically we have a molecule, A, that has this attachment to it called a hydroxide. And then we have a molecule B that has this hydrogen hanging out here. Now in a dehydration synthesis reaction, what we're going to do is we're going to combine these two, and we're going to basically remove a water molecule between the two of them. That's what dehydration is, removing water. So in order to do that, what we're going to do is we're going to break the bonds that are holding this hydroxide and this hydrogen to our A and our B. And this is going to combine to give us a water molecule. So there's our dehydration. Now that allows A and B because now they basically sacrificed the spots where the hydrogen and the hydroxide were attached. They need something attached there, so that gives the A and the B the opportunity now to form this big old honking molecule called AB. This is a classic dehydration reaction in the body. Body uses this a lot to do anabolic reactions, to take small substances and to knit them together into big substances. So typically when we do that, we're going to end up with something that we want, but we're also going to end up with some water. Now, another type of chemical reaction is the decomposition reaction, and as the name implies, it's going to break down bigger molecules into smaller molecules. Well, that sounds suspiciously like a catabolic reaction, doesn't it? Yeah. So let's bring up an example equation. So, oh, no surprise here. Here we have our big honkin' AB, and we're going to turn it into an A plus a B. And like I said, this is the part of metabolism that we would think of as catabolism, where we take the big fat burger and we're going to break it down into some small molecules. Now, this type of reaction is typically going to be what we call the exergonic reaction, where we're going to have the release of energy as a result of taking a big molecule, breaking up those bonds, and ending up with two small molecules. Now, what type of reactions is the body using for these? Well, these would be considered hydrolysis reactions. So hydro means water, and we're lysing water. Lysis means to cleave or to break into. So let's take a look at that reaction. So we can kind of think of the hydrolysis reaction as the opposite of our dehydration reaction. So instead of starting off with A and B, we're going to start off with AB. But we're going to have to pry them apart. And when we pry them apart, they're now going to have this vacant spot where we're going to have to apply something. So let's go ahead and pry them apart. And when we do, oh, this is looking strangely familiar, isn't it? Because now we have these little vacant spots where we need to apply something. Well, the body has an abundance of water, so why don't we take a water molecule and cleave it in two, more or less, and divide it up into a hydrogen and a hydroxide and just put them there. So you see what I mean when I say a hydrolysis reaction is the opposite of a dehydration reaction? In a dehydration reaction, we actually make a water molecule, and in a hydrolysis reaction, we actually use up a water molecule in order to separate substances. So this is basically how the body is conducting those catabolic reactions. This is how the body's taking that big fat burger and turning it into molecules. It uses water in the process. Now, the third reaction is the exchange reaction. It's called a displacement reaction as well. And it involves both synthesis and decomposition, and the making and the breaking of bonds, which is why we would call it synthesis and decomposition. Decomposition is the breaking down of bonds, and the synthesis is the making of bonds. So let's bring up a reaction here. So here we have a type of reaction. So we start off with AB, big honkin' AB, and we're going to have a reaction with C. And what ends up happening here is that basically A breaks up the bond with B, but it then forms a new bond with C, leaving B all on its own. Looks like a tragic tale of meeting somebody better and moving on, right? And then we have this scenario right here where we have A and B and then C and D, and A is going to switch partners with C, and so A is going to end up with D, and then B is going to end up with C as a result. So this is an example of A and B went to the dance together and C and D went to the dance together, but they left with different partners. So these are examples of displacement reactions, as the name implies. And it is going to involve both synthesis and decomposition. And with all of that, we're at the end of USLO 2.3.